I just got done watching the Rachel Nickell documentary on Netflix, and I wanted to analyze what I saw in the documentary. For those who don't know, I have a degree in forensic psychology and a background in law enforcement, so that helps me provide a little bit of unique insight on the case matter as a whole. Now, I will say I have not looked into the case outside of the documentary itself, so just keep that in mind while I discuss what I noticed. First and foremost, I want to talk about Colin Stagg because it's very clear how they frame him in the documentary as this almost chaotic, sexually repressed, like demonic individual because of the images and material inside his personal flat. What's interesting with this is that it's towards the tail end of the Satanic Panic. So the Satanic Panic kind of starts around the 1980s, peaks towards the later 80s, mid 80s, and then kind of trails off in the early 90s. So that's still very much a thing, right? And what people don't understand, or what people tend to forget, is that while a lot of individuals were freaking out about, oh my God, Satanism, it's bad, everybody's a devil worshiper, other people, particularly young individuals, were really leaning into this ideology and pushing back against like social structures and the norm and religion. So the fact that Colin Stagg had like a pentagram on the floor and this, sign on his door saying Christians basically F off, I'm a pagan, really isn't that strange or that weird, but it was presented in a way to say, hey, look, this guy's a freak. In fact, the Satanic Panic really influenced pop culture as a whole, so the fact that Colin would lean into this isn't really that much of a red flag in my opinion. We also have to look at his interview, right? When he's arrested, he goes back to the station. They start questioning him. This is specifically after the letters written by Lizzie James, aka the undercover police officer. Now, what I find interesting is that the documentary doesn't really discuss the content that was written on the undercover police officer's part. How much of this was leading, how much of this was putting the ideas into Colin's head, and then he was writing a response. That's very, very explicitly left out, which is a point of interest for me. But when you look at his body language, right, he's sitting very closed off, he has his arms crossed, he has his leg propped up as a barrier between himself and the investigator, which makes sense, right? He's being accused of a crime that he didn't commit, so he is going to be defensive. Somebody who committed this type of crime is going to have some type of emotional reaction to the stress of being investigated. There's going to be some sort of body shift, some sort of behavioral change, and there's absolutely nothing there. Is that 100% guarantee? No, there are some people, psychopaths in particular, that would be able to suppress that, but they also have the egotistical aspect that people can manipulate to get information from them. So the fact that he was so level-headed, so emotionally regulated, kind of lends to the credence that he was innocent at the time that he was being questioned. And spoiler alert, he is innocent. He didn't commit the crimes. So it wasn't a crime to be weird, but he really got shoehorned for the murders because he was weird. Which, so am I, but whatever. Then we find out who the real suspect is and who the real killer is, which is Robert Napper. And they mention that Robert Napper talks about himself in the third person. And that's something that a lot of people don't do. But there's a couple of reasons for it, right? So when you talk about yourself in the third person, you're creating a type of psychological distance between your mind and yourself. It almost lets you take a step back and look from an outside perspective, right? So instead of saying I did this, it's Emily did this. There's a type of dissociation there. So if Robert's being asked why did you kill Rachel? He's going to say, oh, well, Robert did X, Y, and Z, and that's going to allow him to emotionally regulate and process the crimes he committed without getting emotionally invested, without having those big behavioral changes. Additionally, it almost asserts this type of dominance where you almost are talking of yourself in a higher regard, a position of authority, right? So a ruler back in the day might refer to themselves as the king and say, the king is displeased with this, or something of the sort. It's a sense of grandiosity, but that also still creates a sense of separation, an us versus them mentality. So they kind of work together to really be a self-soothing, distancing type of dialogue. And the last thing I want to talk about is the presence of children when it comes to Robert Napper's crimes. So they talk about how a majority of his crimes, even prior to the murders, children were present. And the forensic psychologist they have in the documentary says that he believes the children were used as bargaining chips for Robert Napper to commit the crimes that he did. And I do think that that makes a lot of sense, and I do think that that is very possible. But what that means is that he was intentionally seeking out women with children that fit a very specific type, which is very unusual because there have been serial killers or serial offenders who have stumbled across, women with kids or people that they want to victimize with children, and they will use the children as a bargaining chip, but it's not something that they specifically seek out because it complicates the process of committing the crime. So I think there's probably other aspects there as well, right? Obviously, it'll help them get more control over the victim. So Robert Napper's basically able to say, hey, if you don't do what I want, like, I'll hurt your kid. But I think there's this weird thrill that Robert has at the prospect of not only victimizing and damaging another person, but having somebody as a witness. Somebody who is able to view what is being done. And I think there's also a power dynamic at play there where he knows that the kid's too young to remember anything. The kid's going to be too young to be helpful. The kid is completely unable to fight back or resist. So I do think while the bargaining chip theory is applicable, I definitely feel that there's more to it. I also think it's interesting that it took him so long to escalate to finally killing a child. And I will be honest, I think the only reason that Alex survived is because he was not a female child. Now, I could be wrong. I don't know what gender all of the kids were with his sexual assaults, but just based on the documentary itself, I think it's likely that Alex survived because he was a boy. I also think Alex likely survived because he wasn't exclusively a white child. Because it seems, at least based on the murders, that Robert Napper had a type, which was white women with blonde hair. Because not only was Rachel white and blonde, Jasmine was white and blonde, and her daughter was white and blonde. And I lied. There's actually one other thing that I do want to talk about. The forensic psychologist describes the perpetrator initially as a disorganized killer, which I do think is true to a certain extent. Typically you have organized killers or disorganized killers, but there is a mixed type, though that's a little more rare. And I personally would argue that Robert Napper is more of that mixed type. Because while he is disorganized in the crime itself, he does have enough planning and foresight and forethought to pick locations that he wants, to not only pick the location but to map it out, and then effectively get away with these crimes. Someone who is truly a disorganized killer, who really wants to go just based off of opportunity, isn't necessarily going to have the foresight to bring the weapon that they want to the crime scene, to stake out the crime scene beforehand, to then effectively commit the crime and then flee and then not get caught. So I personally feel that Robert's a little bit more of a mixed type between organized and disorganized. He's not so organized that he's not, avoiding biological evidence, but he's not so disorganized that he's completely bumblefucking his way around everything. Now, that's all I have to say. If you like this type of content, I make lots of videos on here. I also make videos on YouTube, link in bio. Again, this might be a little off base just because I haven't looked at the case outside of the documentary, but just some things that I noticed and wanted to discuss about the documentary itself. As for Alex and his father, I am very impressed with how they handled everything. They are incredible human beings, and I'm really glad that they were able to salvage their relationship despite the difficulty that they had resulting from the loss of Rachel.